It was one of Australia's most notorious murders. A senior policeman shot dead in the driveway of his suburban home.
A man described as a logical suspect in the murder of Canberra Police Chief Colin Winchester has given up the fight to suppress his identity. He's 43-year-old David Harold Eastman.
A man cleared of killing one of the nation's top police officers is tonight deciding what to do with $7 million in compensation. The payday, the result of the 19 years David Eastman spent behind bars before he was acquitted.
Well, I think the murder of Colin Winchester is one of those enduring police stories which, ironically, a lot of the Australian Federal Police wish would just go away, which is ironic only because it was the execution or the assassination of their Assistant Commissioner. It begins in 1989, in January, when the AFP Assistant Commissioner Colin Winchester was executed in the driveway next door to his home. It shocked the nation, there's no doubt about it. It was at night, and he had just been visiting the home of his brother across the border in New South Wales when Colin Winchester returned home. Now, he parked in the driveway of his neighbour's house, who was an elderly lady, and she kind of liked the fact that he would park in her driveway to give the sort of appearance that there was always someone there and there was activity in the home. So he parked in that driveway as he usually did. And then was shot twice in the back of the head at close range. There weren't any witnesses. There was some audio witnesses, people who thought they heard gunshots and what have you, but there was no real evidence at that time. Now, what happened in the immediate aftermath of that execution probably wouldn't happen in this day, and that is police from all over the city of Canberra descended on that crime scene and tainted the crime scene. There was no barriers, there was no blockades, no one was trying to preserve the scene. Officers who were very close to Winchester, who was a very popular man in the force, were actually going into the car and hugging his body. In one extraordinary incident, somebody took the keys from him, from his pocket, from his side here, and went to his office to go through his office. Now, it's never clear why that happened, other than that officer said, well, I just wanted to see if there was any hints of why this crime took place.
The Winchester inquest, now in its fourth week, has looked at evidence from the policeman's family, police forensic experts, and concentrated for over a week on evidence concerning this Canberra man, David Eastman.
David Harold Eastman was interviewed within days of the murder. And when I say within days, I think they first contacted him within 24 hours, and within 3 days they were formally interviewing him. He was, I guess, a disgruntled public servant, would be fair to say. He had some mental health challenges. He's a very, very smart man. I've met him a few times over the years. He's very articulate, very smart. He had what police assumed was a motive. That is, he was very angry against the police. He was angry against Colin Winchester himself as his assistant commissioner, because he had an assault charge against him, and that assault charge was completely random. Was something to do, some personal issue in his life with a neighbour, some dispute, and the way the police will tell the story is that Eastman was worried about whether he would be re-employed in the public service. He was a Treasury official at one stage, which goes to his mental capacity. He was a very smart guy, still is. He wanted to get back in the public service, and he thought the prospects of that would be ruined if he was convicted and/or formally charged with this assault offence. So he asked for the AFP to intercede and to recognise what he said was a domestic issue between neighbours, and they refused, and that made him very, very angry. And that made him a suspect within days. Now, two things happened at that stage. He was being investigated by the ACT AFP. And remember, this is the AFP in its infancy. It had two divisions. It had the ACT policing for general street issues and the like. And then they had a Commonwealth role, which was very much what the AFP is today, the larger national, international investigative body that it is. At that time, 10 years after the AFP was established, the two worked in opposite directions, one doing domestic issues, one doing national and international crimes. And so there were almost two simultaneous investigations going on. One looking to pursue David Harold Eastman as a suspect, the other looking at the Italian mafia as an obvious source. Now, the reason the AFP in its Commonwealth capacity was looking at the mafia were two reasons. One is in what must be seen as one of the most extraordinary and controversial moves by the AFP, they sanctioned elements of the Italian mafia to grow cannabis crops around Canberra and New South Wales. Now, the idea being, let's sanction it, let's watch these crops grow, let's give them permission to grow it to see how many people we can find and build an intelligence around their networks. And of course, these members were all members of the Drangheta, the notorious and one of the most powerful Italian mafia groups in the world. And so that was one element. The other element was within 3 weeks of the murder, the Italian Carabinieri police contacted the then National Crime Authority, which was the other national body in existence at that time, and said, hey, listen, there's two assassins who we have identified through various wiretaps and other information who have been dispatched to Australia. Here are their details. Here is the flight they were on. Here is their arrivals. Here is everything. And that was a valuable intelligence, as you can imagine. Now, the Carabinieri followed that up with a second report and said, we now have intelligence that they were sent to Australia to execute a very senior police officer. You could argue that led to an open and shut case. Wow. Here was a recognised experts in Italian mafia telling the Australian police, here are two suspects, this is their reason for having travelled to Australia. They're not tourists, clearly. They were sent for this reason. Now, when the AFP started looking at these guys and started looking at their connections, all of a sudden they found they were connected to the guys doing or allegedly involved in the plantation of that cannabis in which Colin Winchester, as Assistant Commissioner, sanctioned as authorised for these criminals to conduct that crop to see where it would lead, to see what how many big fish they could capture in that process.
Completely innocent. Federal police frame-up.
He was eventually charged with murder in 1992, which was 3 years after. And then it would be weeks, and I covered some of the initial trial, which went for weeks and weeks. But it was in 1995, in November, that a jury found him guilty as charged for the execution, assassination, murder of Colin Winchester. Now, the case was not without its problems, least of all because of David Eastman and his, propensity to sack his legal team. Now, he didn't stop, and he took it to appeal. He represented himself at times. He had other lawyers represent him at other times. When that failed, he took it to the federal court. That failed. He took it to the High Court. That failed. And then there was a bit of a change in the case, and there was so much outrage or discussion, perhaps is a better word, in terms of were there other suspects, who else was involved, and all that was generated because the AFP sought to have huge swathes of the trial suppressed. So there were elements of his original trial and the original inquest into the death that were suppressed. The public had no idea what it was about. Everyone suspected it was about Italian mafia. There were certainly hints that what it was about, but no one was the wiser. And including the Defence Counsel for David Eastman. So he protested, and finally they ordered an independent inquiry, which was known as the Martin Inquiry, and that was a turning point. So the Martin Inquiry began in 2012, and it found that there was a miscarriage of justice, that in fact there was evidence that was never presented to his defence team or himself when he represented himself, and that was a miscarriage. It also found substantial flaws with the forensic evidence that was presented. Now, the person who presented that evidence, the so-called expert witness, had already been discredited. Some of the experiments, he said, some of the forensic experiments, he said, were questionable. Some of them, Authorities didn't even believe they were even carried out. His knowledge base was brought into question. Overseas experts came in and found his whole case, or that element of the case, laughable. So the Martin inquiry recommended that Eastman be found not guilty, exonerated, his conviction quashed, and or there be another trial. And of course it went to another trial, and he was then found not guilty by a jury for that murder.
David Eastman has been found not guilty of murdering a senior federal police officer in Canberra almost 30 years ago.
In that jury trial that found David Eastman not guilty of the murder of Colin Winchester, there were 23 names, all but 2 who were Italian, which were suppressed as evidence. And so again, that rang alarm bells for many commentators, certainly many in the legal fraternity, who were raising question marks about, well, hang on a minute, you found this guy not guilty of murder, all this evidence related to other possible suspects was suppressed. Why was it suppressed? And that question was never adequately answered. What happened after that was the AFP declared the case closed, arguing there was no further evidence. Now, we know there was some evidence. Certainly there was very strong circumstantial evidence. Certainly there were names and people raised, identities raised, that had a greater motive to murder Colin Winchester, and these were never tested. Now, fast forward to 2018, and the Australian Federal Police announced they were doing a broad and sweeping investigation into the Italian mafia, and the most powerful group in this country being the Drangheta. But they announced all the sort of links and some of the family groups and the clans and where they were based and all the rest of it. Now, in their investigation for that broad inquiry, a lot of the names who were implicated, I guess would be the word, in the Winchester case were raised. And since that case, there were connections made that were not known at the time of the Winchester murder, and certainly not fully explored at the time of the Eastman conviction, retrial, and conviction being quashed. So there is a lot of avenues there that open things up, but still the Winchester case remains closed.